Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner, and we're at our February reading wrap up today. As with last time, we're going to take a look at the stats to begin with, before we then jump into each of the books that I've actually read individually with a quick bit of information about them and what I thought of them. Won't be quite as long as last time, we have less books and some of them I have done videos on as well. But let's just jump straight into the stats first of all. And in February I read 15 books in total, which was 4,006 pages. So compared to January, that's about 900 pages less and 5 books less as well. And we'll see a little bit about why that is later on. In terms of moods, about normal for me. Adventurous made up 9, mysterious 8, dark 7 and tense 6, with emotional, light-hearted, funny and unusually for me, hopeful all being included in the mix. In terms of pace, once again, the majority were medium pace at 11 of the books I read in total, with the remaining 4 being fast-paced. The biggest difference from the previous month, however, came down to number of pages. Whereas the previous month we had a lot of short books and short audio books as well. This time we had 1 book that came in at over 500 pages, 8 that came in at 300 to 499, and only 6 that came in at under 300 pages. So a lot of longer books this month rather than shorter ones. Again, all fiction books, no non-fiction this month. In terms of genres, once again, fantasy comes out on top with 8 hitting the fantasy genre, 6 under the YA, 5 LGBTQIA+, 4 with the horror tag, 3 with romance, 2 short stories, 2 sci-fi, and 1 each for middle grade, classics, thriller, graphic novel, and comics. Obviously, some of these stretch over multiple books, hence why the numbers won't quite add up there. And then in terms of format, almost entirely print this month. I listened to a total of 1 audiobook. I only read 2 books on digital, and then the rest of them were printed books that I own. So, with that being said, let's just jump straight into the list of actual books and talk a little bit about all those. So first off, we have 5 Survive by Holly Jackson. This was a YA thriller that first released in 2022. The version that I read was the paperback version, which came in at 392 pages. And this was solid. My biggest issue with this is that it just wasn't for me personally. The basic premise of this one is a group of friends and acquaintances are making their way across country for a summer camp, and they get waylaid by a mysterious sniper who basically is going to kill one of them for some secrets that they hold. There's some interesting twists and turns in here. Nobody is quite what they appear to be, as you would expect. This is a tense and mysterious and very dark in places YA novel that is very fast-paced. Not for me personally, but if you're a fan of fast-paced thrillers, there might be something for you to enjoy here. Next up we have The Monkey's Paw. This is by W.W. Jacobs and was first published in 1902, and this is a story that is now in the public domain. I've read this on the channel. I will link above to that video. This is a horror short story. It comes in at a mere 32 pages long. I gave it 3.5 stars. It does a fair bit in that 32 pages. The basic premise of this is the family in question come into possession of a monkey's paw, which is a magic, almost talisman-like object that can grant the bearer 3 wishes. However, you don't know how those wishes will turn out, and as with many things, be careful what you wish for, as you may get some unintended consequences. And the back end of the story is the family dealing with the consequences of those wishes. It's pretty creepy. There's some strong imagery here. This is a really quick read and is well worth checking out. Next up, we have Project Nought by Chelsey Furedi. This started life as a webcomic over on Tapas. Comes in at 331 pages long, and this was first published, I believe, in 2017. And this is a digitally drawn graphic novel, and it's really, really good. First of all, the art style is very bright, very vibrant, except in places where they need to emphasize certain moods. The characters in this are really, really lovable as well. The general conceit of this one is that the main character of Ren is pulled forward in time to the future to aid in the studies of history for students in that time, and in theory gets sent back after 6 months with his memory wiped. However, the megacorporation that does this may not be everything it turns out to be. At its core, this is an adventurous and mysterious graphic novel, but it also has a very, very strong emotional connection as well, especially around the idea of Ren discovering who he is. I've not seen many people talking about this one. It's well worth checking out. I will link my review to this one as well. Book 4 on the list is one that I've been meaning to get to for quite a while. This falls under middle grade fantasy, and it's book 1 of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. It is, of course, Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. So my version was paperback, which came in at 375 pages, and this was a solid, fast-paced, very good example of what middle grade fantasy can be. In case you're not aware of the Percy Jackson series, Percy Jackson is the child of one of the Greek gods. Not that he knows that at the beginning, and he comes into his powers following an attempt by creatures from the underworld to kill him. He gets taken to a special camp where he can learn his true origins, and then is sent off on a quest to recover some stolen artifacts. The characters on this are quite lovable. The world is interesting and vibrant, and I do like the way they've explained away the fact that the gods do still exist and how and why they still exist as well. And whilst the reveal for who Percy's godfather really is not a massive surprise really in the grand scheme of things, I still think this is a very good first entry into a series first of all, and I think this is an excellent example of what middle grade fiction can be. Next up, we have the only audiobook I listened to this month, and it is called It Waits in the Woods by Josh Malerman, narrated by Lauren Ezzo. This is one of the Creature Feature Collection books on Amazon, and it comes in at 1 hour and 38 minutes long, and I gave this a 4.75 stars out of 5 rating over on Storygraph. A lot of that is based on the strength of the audio work at play here. This is a very dark, very mysterious, fast-paced horror story, where the main character returns to the Michigan woods where her sister disappeared 3 years previously, to basically spend a night in the woods and document what really happens, because there is a folktale about a monster that lives under the bridge and removes the faces of people it captures. The voice work by Ezzo in here is absolutely exceptional and really does add to the creep factor of this one. I'm not sure how well this translates to the written page, but as an audio piece of work, this is exceptional, and I highly recommend checking this out, as there were some points in this where Ezzo's voice work left literal tingles down my spine. From one horror to another, we have Volume 1 of Something is Killing the Children. So this is the collected editions Part 1 by James Tynion IV, illustrated by Werther, Dell'Edera and Miquel Muerto, and this is also very, very strong. This was originally, I believe, a set of comics, and the idea of this one is that there was a lone survivor after a massacre in the woods, and that lone survivor can't really explain what they saw when a stranger appears in town, hunts down the stranger, and basically takes them with them to find a monster that only certain people can see. Those certain people will be children and people that are specifically predisposed, or monster hunters as a lot of them are. The artwork in this is incredibly sparse, all full of sharp, jagged edges and dark lines, and really does a good job to sell the gruesome nature of this one. I gave this a 4.5 stars out of 5. I'm looking forward to picking up Volume 2 at some point pretty soon. I will say that the artwork for this is pretty gruesome and harsh in places, so be aware of that going in. But this is the first horror graphic novel that I have read, and I am definitely here for this. Going in a very different direction then, we have Broken Hearts and Zombie Parts by William Hussey. This released in 2023 and is 400 pages long, and this is a LGBTQIA romance that follows Jessie Spark, who collapsed at prom following a heart incident and discovers that they have a faulty heart and require a bicuspid valve replacement, if I remember it correctly. Due to this, they decide that they need to do a number of things at high speed. Firstly, to record their video that they need to do for film school about zombie honeymoon, as well as to get their first summer gay experience, because this does have some deep underlying things that it does tackle, specifically around social media pressure and body image, as Jessie is convinced that nobody will ever look at him ever again if he has a great big ugly scar on his body. And it does a very good job of looking at the pressures that young people in particular face with social media now, as well as some of the pressures that actually we put on people as parents, or parents put on us as well. This is funny in places. It's very British in its humour. I absolutely adore it. I gave it 4.25 stars out of 5. That's Broken Hearts and Zombie Parts by William Hussey. Next up, we have the first of the new releases I've spoken about this month, and that is the Absinthe Underground by Jamie Pacton, which came out in February. This is a sapphic romance YA novel in which our two main characters of Esme and Sybil are caught stealing a poster by the proprietor of the Absinthe Underground, who are themselves a fae, and they are tasked with going into the land of the fae to steal the crown jewels for one of the multiple fae queens, and to bring it back to the Absinthe Underground for Maeve. This is a bit slow to get going, but it has a really interesting world, very much inspired by late 19th century Paris. And the characters are likeable enough, if lacking a little bit of depth. But overall, this is a pretty decent light heist novel that is worth checking out. Although I will caution, I have seen this as marketed as Moulin Rouge meets Holly Black, and if you're after the sort of level of fae world building that Black does, you will be disappointed. But still well worth checking out. Speaking of Holly Black, we have The Wicked King, which is book 2 of the Folk of Air series. This comes in at 326 pages long, was first released in 2019. I gave this 4 stars. This is once again a YA fantasy, which I would personally describe more than anything else as a political fantasy. I've seen a lot of people describe this, or the series in general, as a romantic series. I'm not sure that I completely buy that. However, this continues from book 1, where Jude is very much the power behind the throne, where Prince Cardan, or now King Cardan as he is, now rules. And you have a lot more political intrigue and infighting going on, and a lot of political manoeuvring. This continues to be very, very dark in places. I love the dives into Fae lore as well. And I also like the fact that, despite the fact that Jude is actually, for me at least, a dislikable character, you still want to read, and in a way you still kind of root for her. For me, however, the star of the show is Cardan. He isn't on the page as much as you would ideally like him to be, for me personally. But he's here a lot more than he was in book 1, and he's far less of an antagonistic presence. There are some decent twists in here. If you liked the first book, you will certainly like this one. Next up, we have another book 2 and another new release as well, and that is What Feasts at Night by T. Kingfisher. This also released in February of this year, and is a follow-up to the exceptional What Moves the Dead, which was in itself a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. And whilst I don't believe that this is a retelling of any other story, this does continue to follow the exploits of the main character of that one, Alex Easton. This time, Alex is going to a hunting lodge, being joined there by the inestimable Miss Potter from the first book, as well as his longtime friend Angus. And we're not saying that Angus and Mrs. Potter are getting it on. However, that may be the whole idea of this trip. When they get there, the housekeeper has died at some point over the last few months and they haven't been made aware. And this has a really interesting dive into some Eastern European folklore. This does not have the same level of creep and tension as What Moves the Dead does, but it does still have some strong imagery in here, and there is a sense of some tension throughout, just not to the same level. The one thing I will say is the characterization of Alex in particular is very, very different to the way it was in What Moves the Dead. It's a lot more light-hearted and a lot more humorous, which I personally appreciate, and I think it makes Alex a far more likeable character. The emotional gut punch isn't there quite as much, but as much as anything that is because this isn't one of Alex's best friends that is under threat. But this was still a very, very good short story to read. The hardback version that I've got comes in at 160 pages long. I gave this a 3.75 stars out of 5. I think this is a very strong story, and I actually think the characterization in this one is better. It just lacks some of the tension of book 1 in the Sworn Soldier series. Up next we have The Obelisk Gates. This is book 2 of the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. Book 1, 5th season, was one of my 5-star reads of last year, so I've been looking forward to getting to this. Initially this was released in 2016. This comes in at 433 pages long, and whilst this didn't quite live up to the same heights as 5th season, this is still an exceptionally well written book. It just feels like the middle book of a trilogy. I gave it 4.25 stars out of 5. And we are continuing with the story of Essen, specifically throughout the majority of the book, as well as their daughter, Nassun, who is still missing and somewhere else in the world. Nassun is being trained in their abilities and is actually getting used to what they are and accepting who and what they are, whereas Essen is actually learning the true scope of their abilities after being reunited with her former lover and mentor, Alabaster, who is in a bad way, having been slowly consumed and turned into stone after causing the onset of the 5th season. There are strong themes in here once again of the cost of surviving in a harsh world, as well as severe prejudice based on class, race and species, and the obvious one of environmental collapse, which may or may not have been caused by greed at some point in the past. The world building in here is incredibly dense. You get some gradual reveals as well as to why everything is in such a state as what it is, and we finally get a view of what Alabaster's plan was to bring an end to the cycle of seasons. Whether that is for good or ill is unclear at the end of this title, but this is once again an incredibly deep, dense and nuanced fantasy novel, and providing it doesn't fumble the ending, this may well go into consideration for my top 5 fantasy series. The next one has been caused by a friend of mine, Jaleesa. I will link their channel down below, as she was listening to the audiobook for How to Bite Your Neighbour and Win a Wager, which was book 1 of the Guide for Dating Vampire series by Deonn, which I read last year. And this is a short story following Clementine, who is one of the characters in book 2 that I have not yet got to. It's only 17 pages long. It gets a 3.5 stars out of me. Basically, Clementine and their lover are going round a ancient castle as part of a history tour when they discover some things about the history of the place when they fall through a secret door. It's fun, it's light-hearted, it's 17 pages, it's good for what it is. Moving on. So this is the biggest book of the month, and that is Legendborn by Tracy Deonn, book 1 of the Legendborn cycle, and came in at 501 pages. And I didn't love this as much as most people seem to have done online. I gave it 3.5 stars out of 5. The story follows Bree, who is a bright high schooler who is accepted to Chapel Hill as an early applicant. And whilst there, she discovers that not only are there secret societies, some of which date back to the time of King Arthur, but she herself has some latent magical ability inherited on her mother's side. We discover early on that her mother died in a car crash, inverted commas, but something about that scene seemed very, very off right at the beginning, and we begin to unpack why and what has actually happened around that. This book does some things very well and some things in a way that actually kind of irked me early on. The things it does especially well is its use of magic and the different ways that the magic works here. You have the kind of blood magic of the Knights of the Round Table, whereas you have a different sort of more hoodoo-inspired magic that is inherited by Bree, and the way they work in different ways and the cost of those magics is really interestingly explored, and does lean into some of the other themes of exploitation that this also talks about as well. And this book is not afraid to take an unflinching look at the after effects of colonialization and some of the lingering racism and issues that face Black Americans in America today. And it does that very, very well for the most part. My biggest issues with this book is that the first half of it is very clunky and very slow to get going, due to the fact it has a lot of heavy lifting to do in terms of setting the scene and setting the world up. So it does feel quite exposition heavy in places. Also, while some of the action scenes early on are well written, they are over far too quickly to feel like a genuine threat to any of the characters as well. I do, however, have Book 2 blood-marked already on my shelf, as I bought that one first because it had pretty sprayed edges. So I will be reading that soon, and I'm hopeful that I'll have a better time with that one, as this has done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of world building already. This also has, worth mentioning here, the closest that I've seen to a genuine love triangle within reading for quite a while. 9 times out of 10 the love triangles that are described are not actually love triangles, but two people going after the same person. This has something far closer to a mutual 3-way attraction going on, which is appreciated when it's actually done properly. So a solid read, I just found it a bit too clunky in the beginning. That leads us in to A Tempest of Tea by Hafsah Faisal. This is book 1 of a new series called Blood and Tea, and this is another YA fantasy heist story. I gave this a 3.75 out of 5 rating. I'll drop my review at the top. In basics, this is a heist story around Artie, who gets a group together to perform an impossible heist. Once again, this is set in what you would class as late 19th, early 20th century Europe, very much inspired by London. And this felt a bit more flat than it otherwise would have done for me, due to the fact that this is my third fantasy heist story within a 2-month period, and bears a lot of similarities to Six of Crows, which unfortunately does most of the things that this does just better. Also, this does talk about themes of colonialization as well, and again, having just read Legendborn did it better. That being said, this is a reasonably strong heist story. It has vampires thrown in the mix as well. There's some interesting characterizations, some good chemistry going on. You also have 2 concurrent romance angles going on, which you don't see as often. Normally you have one main one and maybe suggestions elsewhere, but they're both given equal time here, and there are some lovable characters. I think if I'd read this at any other time of the year, I would have given it a higher score. I just think because I've read a couple of fantasy heists already in the last 8 weeks and another book that dealt with colonialization better, that this felt a little bit more flat for me personally than it otherwise would if I'd read it at a different time. We ended February on my favourite read of the month. This is The Butcher of the Forest by Premee Mohamed, another new release for this February. This is a novella that comes in at 160 pages long, and I absolutely loved this one. I best think of this as a dark fairy tale as we follow the main character of Veris Thorn as she is dispatched to the magical haunted forest by the local tyrant to rescue his 2 missing children. The forest is well known to be a place to avoid by the locals due to the fact that those who enter never return, and in fact Veris is the only one to ever go in and come out alive and actually with one of the people that have gone missing. There's stings in the tail with this one. It definitely has some Grimm Brothers fairy tale vibes going on with it as well, as Veris journeys through the forest trying to find the missing children and having to deal with the various denizens that live there and the monsters and lies that haunt the place. Absolutely dripping and oozing with atmosphere. This is my easiest recommendation of the month, and I highly recommend you give it a check out. That is The Butcher of the Forest by Premee, Mohamed. March plans then, and March I'm going to be focusing on manga and graphic novels. Now, most of those I'm not going to do a full review on, as they're all volume ones, I should say, of pretty well-known mangas for the most part. But I've never really read manga before, other than a couple that I've covered on the channel, so I'm looking forward to that. Also, there are going to be graphic novels interspersed through that. 3 of those I'm going to speak about on the channel as part of my Banned Books challenge. The first one of those is Genderqueer, which is one of the most challenged books in the US at the moment. Secondly, we have Heartstopper, volumes 2 through 5. Now, my understanding is that 2, 3, 4 are all currently challenged in the US in certain states, but that is only going to count as one entry for my challenge anyway. And the third one is Flamer by Mike Curato. And in case you haven't heard of that one, I'm going to drop a video down below for Michael Romeo Talks Books, who did an amazing video on it a couple of weeks back. Well worth checking out. That is hopefully going to be here in the next couple of weeks. On top of that as well, we have 2 new book releases this month. The first one is called Revenant Games by Maggie Fulton. And then I have Chrysalis and Requiem by Quentin Lee, which is out at the back end of the month. Hopefully I'll get that one in before we get to the end of March. It does not have a general UK release, so it's going to take a little bit longer to get here. But yeah, that's what I have planned for this March. I hope you've enjoyed your video. What are you planning on reading throughout the next month? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all soon.